Hi everybody. In this lecture I'm going to be talking about literary criticism. What does that mean? What is it? And how do we use it? So how do we read a piece of fiction, a piece of nonfiction, a short story, creative nonfiction, a novel, and analyze what are its parts, what are the pieces that make it up, and what do they mean to us? Why is the story good or bad, fundamentally? We're going to be reading a short story this week called A Basket Full of Wallpaper by Colin McCann. So I'm going to use that as an example for this lecture. So you can read it before or after the lecture, or ideally I would read it before the lecture, listen to the lecture, and then read it again to do an analysis in order to do the discussion properly. But before we get into answering those questions, you should think about what sort of fiction or nonfiction do you all like to read? Do you have a favorite book or a favorite story? Do you like to read poetry? Do you like to read plays? Who are the favorite characters in those stories? This could even apply to graphic novels or comic books. Anything that's got the written word in it, right? So you can think about some of those as examples when I'm using these different types of analysis. Okay, so the main question to ask yourself is, why do you find certain stories appealing? What is it about the characters? What is it about the dialogue, the description, the setting, the action that you find entertaining or emotionally moving? Does it give you ideas of new ways to see the world, new ways to interpret the world we live in and find a sort of larger truth? So what is it about the stories you read that you like? Trying to answer that question will help when doing literary analysis. Of knowing what you like will help you analyze a story to figure out, okay, what do I like about it or what do I not like about it? I'm going to list out a handful of other ways to do this, to make this question and analysis more specific. So the first of these to apply, beyond knowing what you like, is what genre does the story fit into? Some of you may know the word genre. You may know what genre is, but I'll give a brief definition. Genre is a set of expectations in setting, character type, technology, that are pinned onto certain types of fiction. So if we pick a particular genre, there are certain things that we expect to have in it. So for example, science fiction is a genre. And it falls into its own category because there are certain things that we expect to see in it. So probably there are going to be certain character types, right? There might be the sort of space explorer, right? You might think of Star Trek, or this sort of heroic rebel space explorer, something like Star Wars. We might also expect certain settings. We might expect it to happen in outer space or on other planets or in other time periods. And we might expect certain types of technology, right? We expect the technology to be more advanced than what we have now. Things like, time travel and, faster than light travel, all that sort of stuff. That's an expectation of the genre of science fiction. If you're reading another genre, like literary fiction, which is just everyday fiction, we expect a variety of different characters because it's about everyone in the world, right? So it could be any regular person. The setting should be usually either modern day or close to it, right? We're expecting it to be in our own time period. And the technology should be the same. So we're expecting it to be a depiction of the reality that we live in. So that's literary fiction. There's a whole bunch of other genres. If you're reading horror fiction, well, we expect the character type sometimes to be someone that's more vulnerable, right? So often horror involves like teenagers or children sometimes, not always, sometimes. Often, the plots are based around some sort of gruesomeness, right? So someone being murdered or some horrible thing happening. And, they're usually focused in those sort of settings where those things can happen, right? So it's like a dark and stormy night, or it's an abandoned house, or you're camping in the woods, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these genres. Mystery, we have certain associations with a mystery story. We have a certain association with Westerns, right? Westerns have to have, cowboys, cowgirls, Native Americans. This is a setting of the Western, right? It's going to have a certain level of technology, which is not as advanced as ours because it's set in the 19th century. We're going to have certain character types. We've talked about the cowboy archetype in other lectures. So that's genre. So one of the first things to do in analyzing a story is ask yourself, what genre is it in? Is it fulfilling the expectations of the genre? Is it not? That could be a reason why it's good. It could be a reason why it's bad. Another question to ask yourself, the sort of fundamental question to ask yourself when doing literary criticism, beyond genre, is, did you like it? Now, this in part connects to the agreement between the reader and the writer. When a writer tells a good story, people are willing to pay you money for it, or give their energy in some sort of way, right? They're going to read your webpage. If the story breaks that contract, where it no longer is immersive, it's no longer sort of real, it no longer creates this sort of alternate reality in the mind, then people don't want to read anymore. So one of the first questions you can ask is, does it fulfill that contract? Was it immersive? Did I want to keep reading? Did it create this alternate world in my mind? Okay. The other question to ask when you're figuring out did you like it or not was, what parts of it did you like and what parts of it did you not like? Did you like the dialogue? Did the characters speaking it seem real? Did you like the description? Did it make things seem very real or very beautiful? And then, you can also think about what parts of it were emotionally impactful? What parts of it moved you? Did they make you happy? Did they make you sad? Did they make you laugh? And what events from your own life caused that, right? So could you relate to the story? Did you relate to the characters? Did you relate to the events? Or even if you didn't, was it something that was so new and so different from your experience you found that exciting? So if you're answering the question of why you liked a story, you should try to answer some of those questions. I liked the dialogue. I liked the description. I didn't. I couldn't relate to the story. I could. I couldn't relate to the story, but I thought it was awesome anyway. So that's number 2. So we'll put over here genre is step number 1. Step number 2, did you like it? Step number 3 is questions about the problems that confront the characters in the story and how they're solved. So every story fundamentally has to have a problem in it, because if there's no sort of problem to overcome for the characters, it's hard to move the narrative forward. So sometimes a character can have a problem with another party. That would be the antagonist. You have the protagonist and the antagonist. But the antagonist could be other things. It could be the protagonists themselves. They could have to overcome something within themselves. It could be a force of nature. It could be technology. It could be any number of things. The thing to keep in mind when doing this sort of analysis is, did you like how the plot was set out and how the problem was overcome? This is fundamentally what a plot is. It's overcoming problems. So, when thinking about the plot, you've got a couple of questions to answer in your analysis. Is, what is the plot? And fundamentally, there's really only 2 types. So every story has a problem that has to get solved. The question is, where do we start with that problem? There's 2 ways to do this. The one way is the obvious way. You start at the beginning of the problem, and then you go until the end of the problem. The other way, in Greek, is called in medias res. So we can either, 1, start with problem, or 2, In medias res, which means in the middle of things. So sometimes stories will start in the middle of the narrative, so the problem has already occurred and the main characters are halfway through dealing with it, right? And then we have flashbacks after that to catch us up. So you see this in films a lot, right? Where it'll start with an action scene and there's all these crazy problems and you're like, what is going on? And then the scene after that, they'll catch you up to speed. They'll sort of backtrack and say, this is what the problems were and this is how we're trying to solve them. So it can be an effective way to run a plot, but those are basically the two ways. You start at the beginning, you start in the middle of things. This also corresponds to the ideas set up in Aristotle's Poetics, which many of you are probably familiar with. This gets covered a lot in high school English. In the Poetics, he talks about a piece of fiction or a play having 5 parts to its plot. So we have an intro, we have a rising action, we have a climax, we have a falling action, and then we have a denouncement. And Aristotle argues in Poetics that if a play or a piece of fiction doesn't have these 5 parts, then it's flawed in some way. So we need an introduction to tell us who the characters are and maybe what the problem is. The rising action is a portion of the play or piece of fiction where the problem gets worse and the characters are trying to solve it and everything they do makes it worse. And then the climax is the portion of the piece where the characters either overcome the problem or they die, or they don't overcome it. They get defeated some way. The falling action is sort of what happens. So if they overcome the problem, how do they celebrate? Well, how does that change the world? And if they don't, well, what's the funeral planning? And then the denouncement is sort of the final commentary on what does this story mean? Should we be happy or sad? What's the deeper meaning in this story? So those are things to analyze with the plot. And you can think about this in the story for reading this week. Does it start in the middle of things? Does it start with the problem at the beginning? Does it have an intro, rising action, a climax, falling action, and denouncement? Where are they in the story? So that's one other piece to use for literary criticism. Fourth one is language analysis. So this is looking at the story and seeing what sort of tropes or figures of speech does it use. Tropes is a fancy word for basically figures of speech or types of literary constructions. So things that fall under tropes include like metaphors, right, which is comparing something directly, or similes, which compare something using like or as. Figures of speech, so alliteration, right, where you have the initial sound of 2 words are the same. You could have personification, where you're using language to take something that isn't actually alive, so animals, ideas, and inanimate objects, and making them real. So like clouds weeping, the sun smiling, joyful flowers. Those are all examples of personification. You could have another type as hyperbole, so exaggeration for emphasis. People say all the time, like, I'm starving. They're not actually starving, they're just hungry. That's hyperbole. Or if you're waiting in line somewhere, you might say, oh, I've been here for ages. Well, you actually haven't. That's hyperbole. So where does the author use these types of tropes? Where is the metaphors? Similes. Alliteration. Personification. Hyperbole. Even like onomatopoeia, which is using language to depict sounds. So, whack, right, if you hit something with a hammer, or sizzle, if you're frying something on a grill, or, noises animals make, like hiss for cat, or meow, right? That's onomatopoeia. So you can use a language analysis to go through a story and say, I liked this story because, they had really cool metaphors, or their alliteration made the language sound good. Their hyperbole was really fascinating. This is often associated with description of things, right? Or you could say, I didn't like the story because they didn't have any sort of interesting language, right? Their metaphors or similes were boring, etc., etc., etc. So that's literary analysis. Language analysis. Number 5 is character analysis. When it comes to characters, there's really only a handful of primary character types. So there are what you might call archetypes, which are sort of particular, more specific characters, right? So we talked about the cowboy archetype. You could talk about the sort of hero archetype or the femme fatale archetype. There's a whole bunch of them, right? But the ones that I want to point out are a little bit larger than this, and they really only fall into 3 categories. So the first is the hero archetype, and this is sort of one of the oldest archetypes. It's a character type that exists in every kind of ancient story, right? So if we're talking about Greek myths and legends, or legends out of ancient texts from India, all over the world, every story has a hero type. So usually they're some sort of royalty, or they're somehow related to the gods or God, and they usually are very upstanding and moralistic, and they're bigger than life, right? They have superpowers, more or less. You think of like Hercules from Greek myths, or any of those sort of heroes. They all have super strength, or they can fly, or they have other abilities that regular humans don't have. So that's a hero type. Later on, it kind of develops into sometimes a character that doesn't necessarily have superpowers, but they're still bigger than the average person, right? They can overcome all sorts of things that most people can't. So that's a hero type. And this is a type that was very popular in world literature from the beginning of time, basically, all the way up until about the Industrial Revolution and the start of modernism. When modernism came around, people got somewhat tired of reading about heroes because their life wasn't like that. They were like, I'm not a hero. I don't have superpowers. I'm just an average person. I want to read about other average people. So this created what is called realistic protagonist. So we'll put hero, realistic protagonist, and the realistic protagonist is an everyday person. They have some control over their lives, right? They usually can influence the world in some way, but they don't control it the way a hero does. They're not the sort of controller of the action of the world. And they also are maybe not as morally upright. They may have a set of flaws, just like we all do. As the 20th century dawned, and the world wars occurred and other horrific things, many people got tired of reading about realistic protagonists because their lives were so bad, or they'd been so traumatized by the sort of horrors of the 20th century, that they wanted to read about people who were even worse off than a realistic protagonist. And this is the anti-hero. The anti-hero is a character who is controlled by the world more than they control the world. So often they're someone who's in a situation like, they've been drafted right into the military and they have to serve in a war that they don't like, or they've been put into prison, or they've been captured by some enemy and they're going to be executed, or whatever horrible stuff. Or they're stuck in a job and they don't have any other options. They have to do that job. They can't get out of it. That's an anti-hero. And these sort of characters were created because that's what people related to. So this is another way to analyze a story. Think about what kind of character does it have. Are they a hero, right? And we could think of examples of this. You could think of Hercules, right, as a hero. You could think of Luke Skywalker as a hero, right? He's larger than life. He has superpowers, all that sort of stuff. Regular everyday characters, this is often found in literary fiction. So, if you're reading a classic piece of literary fiction, if you're reading Toni Morrison or something, all of her characters are generally realistic protagonists. They're going about their lives. They have some influence on the world, but it doesn't control them. If you're looking for anti-heroes, there's plenty of those. This occurs a lot in war fiction. It occurs a lot in prison fiction or fiction about the worst parts of the 20th century. But we also see it in some popular characters. It's arguable that Batman is a anti-hero, right? He's had a horrible life. His parents were murdered, and he is sort of controlled in part by the evil forces that he's fighting against, right? He's sort of controlled by the Joker. He can't not fight him. He can't sort of get over his neuroses of the Joker killing his parents. And so in that way, he's kind of controlled by the world. And he also has all sorts of moral problems. Batman has all these issues with, controlling anger, how to confront evil, how to confront surveillance, all that sort of stuff. So, character types is another way to analyze the story. The sixth one is themes. What is a theme? Some of you may have an idea, but it's a little abstract, so I'll put it out there. A theme is an abstract idea that emerges from literary work's treatment of its subject matter. I won't write all that out, but basically I'll put an abstract idea from work. So when a work references a particular abstract idea over and over again, that's a theme. It has to be repeated. So if you read A Basket Full of Wallpaper, a handful of themes will jump out at you. So one of them is war, right? Because the secondary character, Asobe, the primary character, Sean, assumes that he's a refugee from Hiroshima, that he fled after it was bombed during the Second World War with the nuclear weapon. So this comes up again and again and again. There's multiple passages throughout the story where there's a reference to war. That's a theme. There could be other things, right? So larger abstract ideas. So stories could deal with racism. That could be a theme. They could deal with sexism. They could also be positive. A story's theme could be, love overcomes everything, or, the value of friendship. Any of those sort of things. That's a theme. So when you're analyzing a story, you can say it's good or it's bad because it develops particular themes. That it has an underlying abstract idea that comes out of the story because it gets repeated. There's certain motifs, certain topics get mentioned. This also could, be generated by what the characters, talk about, or what the characters are worried about. Okay, so those are the main 6 ways of dealing with literary analysis, of applying each of these to a story to figure out, whether it's good or not. So the first one is, did you like it? I listed it second, it doesn't really matter the order. But, did you like it? Why was the story moving to you? Why was it not? The first or second one is genre. Do you like that genre? What genre is it in? Does it fulfill the expectations of that genre? The third is narrative structure. Does it have a problem that gets solved? Does it fulfill Aristotle's 5 categories? Does it start in the middle and then backtrack? Does it start with the problem? Those questions. For language analysis, does it use language in unique and refreshing and beautiful ways? Does it use a variety of tropes? If it doesn't, maybe it's not as good of a story. Character analysis. So does it have a hero, a realistic protagonist? Does it have an anti-hero? Another thing to think about with heroes also is, what are their flaws, right? What is the primary flaw of the character? And how does that flaw drive them towards a larger goal? So what do they want out of life? What are they yearning for? What are their deepest hopes and fears? What do they want to get? And how is their flaw, their sort of character flaw, preventing them from doing that? And you can also think about, by the end of the story, do they achieve that goal? Do they overcome their flaw? That's another part of character analysis. So that's another way of thinking about character analysis, overcoming flaws. And then the last one is themes. So what themes does the story contain? How do we know that? Where do they show up? So if you were using that to answer a discussion question, you would need to show probably at least 3 different places where this particular abstract idea gets referenced for it to be a theme. The last question you can add is moral. What larger moral point is the story making? This kind of relates to themes. Is the story trying to say something like sexism is bad, racism is bad, war is terrible? What moral point is the story making? You could make an argument that a story having a moral point is important. Some people would argue that that's not important, that it's much more about the aesthetics of the story. So what sort of tropes, description, what sort of dialogue, what sort of realistic characters does it have? But it's one more potential way to analyze a story. So for this week, use these 7 parts of literary analysis to figure out what you like about the story or what you don't like about it. All right, that's it.